Once you have your gathering stitches all along the waistline of your skirt, you can then go ahead and create this nice gathering effect all along the waistline by pulling the bobbin threads at each end of each section. I'm going to go ahead and look on the wrong side, and I'm going to find one set of ends of my gathering stitches. And there they are. Now it's very important during the remainder of this process that you pull only the bobbin threads. You're going to leave the needle thread, the top thread, alone. Once you have the entire top edge of your skirt nicely gathered, you can move on to attaching this to the bodice. To do this, I will position the waistline of my skirt horizontally in front of me, with right side facing up. Next, I'm going to find my bodice, and I will position it right side down and upside down, bringing it into alignment with the top edge of the skirt. Now to pin. First, I will pin the edges that I find here to the right. Just ensuring that the right edge is lined up beautifully. Next, I'm going to find my notches in the center front area. So we have 3 notches, one in the center front and one to either side of it. So the center front notch matches to the center front notch on the bodice. And notice that I'm choosing to pin the bodice side on top with the skirt underneath. Next, I'll work on pinning the notch to the right of the center front to the notch to the right of the center front notch on the skirt. So notice here that you'll end up with some excess fabric, at least I do at this point, because my fabric isn't ruffled enough on the skirt in this region. So if you have a big mismatch at this point, it might be helpful to gather it a little more before pinning. You're going to be able to make adjustments later on. But I do find that it helps to have it gathered a little closer to where you're going to want it when all is said and done as you're pinning. And then you can make those fine adjustments after it's pinned. Here we go. I found my notch again on my skirt, and since I was careful to ensure that my notches were triangular shaped, that's making it a little easier to find right now, even though the edge of my skirt is ruffled. Okay, so now I'm going to match the notch on my skirt to the notch on the bodice. And you can see now, since I ruffled the skirt more, that those edges are actually matching now. Next, I'm going to find a place to pin this side bodice seam. And the side bodice seam does not match to the side skirt seam. So that's something a little peculiar about this pattern that you need to watch for. So instead, the bodice side seam attaches to the square symbol that you should have marked on your skirt back pieces. So here it is. I marked my square with 4 little dots. Instead of trying to draw a square, I like to just mark the corners of the square. And there it is, and I can actually see it a little bit through to the right side of the fabric, which is helpful. I'm going to go ahead and lay the bodice side seam right over that square, and I'm going to pin right there. For this pin, make sure that you're not inadvertently catching any of your tie in your pin. You don't want to sew over your ties. You're just going to want to sew right along the waistline, keeping the ties free, sandwiched in between these 2 layers. So at this point, once again, I'm seeing that I have a big mismatch that I'm about to have between my skirt and my bodice. So to make it a little easier, I'm just going to leave that pinned, but I'm going to gather this a little more and that a little more so that these edges start to match up a little better. Okay, so that is better. Now I can just distribute the gathers just a little better in this region. And once I'm getting a pretty good match there, I'm going to start popping some pins in. By pinning on the top layer, I'm going to make it easier on myself to sew on the top layer once this is all pinned in place. When I'm sewing a gathered element to a flat piece of fabric, I find that it's easier to pin and sew with the flat layer on top. As I'm getting ready to sew the final bit here, I'm going to make another slight adjustment here just to make it a little tighter. Okay, so now I'm going to work to this region to the right of the bodice side seam. And so first of all, I'm going to eyeball it. And once again, I see that I have a pretty large disconnect. Not severe, but you know, relatively large disconnect between the gathered side and the bodice side. So I'm going to go ahead and gather the skirt part a little more at this point. Pulling out those bobbin threads. And slide to the left. Oh, now I went too far, so I'm going to undo the gathers a little bit. So you can see, if you ever gather too much, you can just spread them apart. Easily fixed. Now, as you pin this back region, make sure that your dart stays flipped in the correct position, which is to say it should be flipped towards this straight center back area. And then eventually I'll get to a pretty happy place with it as I'm redistributing my gathers to make them a little more neat and tidy. Sometimes you might want to flip the skirt over so that you can see your gathers a little more clearly to redistribute them. And that's looking pretty good, so now I'm going to flip it back over and start matching these edges and pinning. Now you'll notice, because of the way we applied our gathering stitches, the end of the skirt here is going to be flat against the bodice, and that's as it should be. So the gathering begins at the circle. And at the dart, it's helpful to put a pin right down the middle of it to make sure that it stays flipped in the correct position as you go along. And on the topic of darts, also make sure that your center darts are flipped in the correct direction, which is to say towards the middle, towards the center front of the bodice. And now that's looking pretty good from center to side. That's how it looks in the back. Once that's done, you can go about pinning the other half in exactly the same way. There's the square symbol. Final stretch. Now all that's left to do is to sew with 5/8 inch seam allowance all along this edge. Doing a little back stitch at the beginning and at the end as usual. Stitch with the bodice layer on top and remember to pull out your pins as you go.